Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. We have received many questions from you, our viewers, on the topic of female slavery. Of particular concern has been Daesh's use of sex slaves. The group claims that this is in line with Islam. Let's go back to the Quranic text and sit down with Dr. Shabir Ally to analyze and make sense of Islam's perspective on female slavery. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So what is Islam's view on concubines?
Well, rather than say Islam's view, I'd have to dissect this now and say, okay, what does the Quran say? Because there could be Quran statements, there could be Hadith statements, there could be scholars' statements. And Islam often is thought to be like an amalgamation of all of these, and it gets confusing sometimes. So in essence, generally in classical Islamic thought, it is taken for granted that a Muslim man can have up to 4 wives at once. And in addition to the 4 wives, he can have an unlimited number of concubines, which refer to women who are basically have slave status. When they are owned by her master, a woman owned by her master has to freely give herself to the master. The master has the right to have sexual relations with her as though she were one of his wives. Is
there a verse in the Quran that specifically states what you had said?
Often verses of the Quran are called into play in discussion of this topic, but the verses are not so clear as one might expect. There are 2 verses, for example, in which speak about what your right hands possess. Surah 23 at the beginning and Surah 80. Which happens to be not a long surah, so it's easy to find the verse, which says that the believers are those who guard their private parts except from their wives and what their right hands possess. But curiously enough, while this is often interpreted to mean that a man could have sexual relations with his female slaves, it is never interpreted to mean that a woman could have sexual relations with her male slaves. So obviously, in the classical interpretation, the broad statement of the Quran was already given some limitation. And we could ask why only that one limitation, or have they really captured the meaning of the verses? So we'll need to come back to that and look at some alternative possibilities when we deal with the Quranic text. Another interesting verse is in Surah 4, verse number 25, which tells Muslim men that if they cannot afford to marry free women, then they can marry a believing woman from among their right-hand possessions.
What is the reference? What does right-hand possession mean? Because I know you mentioned that earlier as well.
Well, this is taken to be a way of speaking about ownership, ownership of slaves. So your right-hand possession, that's what you own. So in this verse, Surah 4, verse number 25, the prescription is that men who cannot afford to marry free women can marry a believing woman from among their right-hand possessions, meaning one of their female slaves. So some can argue that this verse, by enjoining on men that they marry the female slaves, and furthermore it says that they're to have them as muhsanatin ghayra musafihat, as chaste women, not women who are promiscuous. So this should not be a promiscuous relationship. It should be one of decency, and a man then is going to have relations with his female slave, but not by virtue of the fact that she's a slave, but by virtue of the fact that he's married to her.
And does consent play into this at all, or can we understand anything about consent from this end? Like, does the female slave have to consent to that, or is it kind of like because she's owned and so therefore?
In the classical thought, the understanding is that by virtue of the fact that she's owned, she does not have the right to consent, or to withhold herself from her master. The master has the full right over her, and her consent does not play anything in this relationship. But by contrast, if you allow me for a moment, we should understand that in the ancient world, women did not have many rights. And even marriage was not, as we might expect it today, like a relationship of equality between spouses. So in the Quran itself, a woman is, her husband is referred to as her Baal, which literally means her Lord. The idea that she would have consent in the marriage itself, this is stated in so many different ways in the Quran, but classical Muslim interpreters of the Quran, some of them said that the woman's main responsibility in a marriage is to fulfill the sexual needs of her husband. And for that reason, the husband has the right and the claim to this, and she cannot refuse. So some of them even speak of the possibility that the man could force himself onto his wife, and she cannot refuse, because that is his right. Of course, this is not ideal, and none of them would say that this is an ideal situation. And they would expect the woman to be cooperative, and regardless of what she's doing, whether she's busy cooking or whatever, when her husband calls her for that particular act, she should be ready and willing to engage. So the woman in marriage itself did not have so much right as we might expect of women today, and we would argue for today, even within the Islamic context. When women did not have this full right, then it's not a far cry from the position of slavery, or we can say rather that the distance that we see between the free woman and the slave woman is somewhat
not so far
minimized.
Yeah.
Somewhat minimized. I may add to this that the word for a divorce in the Quran is talaq, and talaq literally means release. So it is as if the woman was in a situation here in which she might be released. And what is often quoted as the last sermon of the Prophet, peace be upon him, may not be authentic, but nevertheless these words are collected on placards and sometimes put up in Muslim homes as the last sermon of the Prophet. Most often they're found in mosques. And in that sermon, the Prophet, peace be upon him, urges men to take care of their women and be aware that God is overlooking them while they have this power over their women. The women are with them like slaves. That's the terminology that is being used. Of course, they're not slaves. They're free women, and they're married. They're wives. But when we understand this broader context, we can see how the interpreters thought of female slaves as having a secondary status, even below this, and that their consent did not matter in this relationship. They were fully owned, and the master had the right to all of the woman.
So it sounds like this was more relatable in some ways to previous times. What about how do we understand this within our context today?
Yeah, well, we can say that because it's related to previous times, that prior to Islam, this was a normal practice. We know from the Bible in the book of Genesis that Abraham had a concubine, Hagar, from whom Ishmael was born, and Ishmael became the father of 12 princes, and God promised Abraham that Ishmael would be a great nation. So a great nation gets born from this kind of relationship, and nobody said that Abraham was a bad man for having a concubine, and the Bible seems to approve of it. In fact, there are other passages in the book of Exodus which speak about this possibility of a man owning a concubine. Moreover, the prophet Jacob, from whom we get the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, some of them were born through concubine relationships because Jacob married two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and each was in a competition with the other to get more children, and not so much to bear the children themselves, but each had a handmaid that they gave to Jacob to be mothers for his children and mothers of their children. So what children were born through their handmaids were counted as their children. So two tribes developed, or two sets of the tribes developed out of that relationship. So this was not seen to be something bad or backward. It was natural for the time. So the question is for us today as Muslims, Did the Quran prescribe something new here out of divine wisdom, or is the Quran just simply tolerating a practice which was already known before and which Muslims need to do something about? What the Quran encouraged Muslims to do was to free the slaves, and if Muslims continued to do that, as the Quran recommended and even prescribed in some circumstances, then slavery would have dried up altogether in Muslim lands, and Muslims would have been the first to declare that slavery is abolished once and for all. But unfortunately, some Muslim states shamefully became the last holdouts in insisting that slavery is still a valid practice. And you will find to this day that there are Muslim scholars of some of the highest ranks and most respected in the Muslim world, who continue to say that rather that it is a shame that we have abolished slavery, and this is a divine right that God has given to the believing men to have female slaves. And so theoretically for them, it still is applicable, and not only theoretically, but they state so in clear terms that if there is a war between Muslims and non-Muslims today, and the Muslims capture the non-Muslim women, the non-Muslim women will be made slaves, and of course the men would have right to sexual congress with them. So somebody like the groups like ISIS and so on could be following this sort of ruling which is there. So they're not all nuts for thinking that they can do this. They're following religious rulings, but we should say that those religious rulings are wrong. They're out of place. They failed to see the context, the historical situation in which these rulings were first explicated.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.